Welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. Thank you, as always, for joining me for another episode of the show. We have the NBA playoffs going on right now, and it's been one of the more interesting playoffs we've had in recent years, I would say. But I kind of today wanted to talk about a team that unfortunately was eliminated in the first round of the playoffs, and that's the LA Lakers. A team that I think, whether you like the Lakers or hate the Lakers or are indifferent on the Lakers, are a fascinating franchise to kind of track. And to talk about them today is my guy from Threads, who I know from Threads, Ken Cosey. Ken, thank you so much for joining me on the episode today.
Omar, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Anytime anybody wants to talk Lakers, I'm here for it.
Awesome. And, Ken has been on the Threads community there in the NBA Threads community really since its inception.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where him and I connected, and always a great basketball conversation via text, and now doing it in podcast format. So I'm very much looking forward to it. So, Ken, let's get into you personally as a Laker fan first. I always like to know people's kind of origin stories, their backstories with how they became fans. So how did you become a fan of the Lakers, when you first initially start following the team?
My fandom for Kareem Abdul-Jabbar goes back to when we knew him as Lou Alcindor when he was at UCLA. He was my favorite basketball player as a kid. And so when he left UCLA and was drafted by the Bucks, I became a Bucks fan. When he got traded to the Lakers in 1975, I became a Lakers fan. And then over the time, they added Magic, they added Byron Scott later, they added Worthy, they add, Michael Cooper, all the guys that we know from their championship runs and Showtime and et cetera. I've just maintained my Lakers fandom ever since.
And that way you're kind of started as a predecessor for the I'm a fan of a player, not a team thing. And then it shifted into the team thing, right?
Yes.
We've seen that with like LeBron fans, for example, over the years,
exactly.
where they follow LeBron wherever he goes.
And I think for me, Omar, the biggest thing is it really is Lakers over any individual. I loved Kobe. I loved LeBron. I loved all the guys from Showtime, Shaq, all those guys. But when Shaq got traded, for instance, from LA to Miami, it was still Lakers, and it always has been.
Yeah, sometimes you get a era that kind of cements it for you, I think, too, right? Which always helps. And I think throughout fandoms, you'll see that in different shapes and varieties. I'm sure, like a fan of the Charlotte Hornets might have seen like Kemba Walker and just got stuck with it, for example, right? I want to fast forward now to the big trade that happened this year for the Lakers, obviously acquiring Luka Doncic, such a huge deal. And everybody is obviously focused on the Dallas side. Like, how could Dallas allow this to happen? How can you trade this guy at the peak of his powers, basically, or entering the peak of his powers, and all that? And it's been a lot of reaction from the Mavs side, which, quite frankly, is the more interesting side to cover, right? Like, this fan base is super, devastated that they lost this guy who sent them to a finals just last year. From the Lakers side, what was your reaction when that trade happened?
Well, Omar, oddly enough, I was watching a basketball game that night, along with a lot of us, and I had fallen asleep before I heard about the trade. So I didn't hear about it until the next morning. And so I logged into Threads, and basically they shut the whole internet down apparently that night into the next morning. I was shocked. Actually, shocked is probably an understatement. I was like, what in the world are we doing? But, as time went on and it sank in, first of all, I felt bad for AD. Because if you'll recall, AD made a comment about basically not wanting to play the 5. He much preferred to play the 4. And I'm not a big believer in coincidences, Omar. I think him saying something to that effect might have had something to do with him getting traded. I don't know that for sure. But but he had made it known all along he prefers to play the 4. He feels like he's a better player with another big next to him who plays the 5. So whatever happened from the AD perspective of things happened. For me, the whole thing with getting Luka, there were a couple of things. Number one, as we all know, for better or for worse, the Lakers are a star-driven franchise. They've always had stars. They'll always be stars. It's just the allure of playing, for the Lakers team. So now the Lakers have their star player, hopefully, for the next decade or so. And then the other thing I thought about from the Luka perspective is he ever going to shake the lack of faith, the lack of confidence that the Mavericks had in him? Because obviously that must have fallen off the table for him to actually be traded, right? So the biggest thing that I feel about the trade right now is, in the short term, it's great. However, the short term might really be short, because Luka could become a free agent after next season, right? And trust me, every NBA team, including the Lakers, well, I guess except for Dallas, is going to have some sort of interest in him. So, I think it's later this summer, or however that works, and they can offer him the extension, I will feel a lot better about the trade. The shock having worn off, the first round elimination having worn off, I will feel a lot better about that trade if he signs an extension.
Yeah, that's the big thing, right? Because everybody immediately was like, "Oh my God, Dallas malpractice. How do you allow this guy to go?" And the extension isn't inked in yet, right?
Right.
Realistically, I think most people have a 95% confidence rate that he's going to sign the extension, right? You
Right.
don't get traded to the Lakers without them thinking that they had a pretty good chance of doing the
Exactly.
extension. But I think about it from the AD perspective, like you mentioned, and Dallas on paper, when he got traded there, obviously they were ravaged by injuries immediately after, himself included, where AD missed some time. Where it's like, okay, I get to play with Daniel Gafford, who's like established as the center, and Derek Lively as well, who's also established as a center. I could really be in that 4 spot, and I play with a great point guard in Kyrie Irving. And so you're like, oh, that makes sense from if you're looking at AD. I think what really just shook people, and what shook me, is the fact that there was this sentiment that Luka was going to be this Dallas guy through and through. He's going to be Dirk 2.0. And all indications are that that's exactly what happened in his mind, that he was like, I thought I was going to be here forever. I just bought a house, that whole thing. Not that it's, it's easy for him to be able to get another house, I guess, considering the money he makes. But
right.
There is some, mental aspect there. And I just think the whole reaction was just shocking, right? Where the Lakers are like, oh, how did we do this? We got it. We got the guy, and this is, again, a top 5 player in his prime who's going to be great for the next 10 years. So you mentioned this earlier about how Lakers, they're a team that always gets a star, right? You kind of go through, if you kind of charted out a timeline, going all the way back to George Mikan when they're in Minneapolis, all the way to now, there's very few, seldom years where they don't have an elite superstar. It was Weston Baylor into Kareem and Magic, and then eventually Kobe and Shaq. And now, obviously, you had the title with LeBron, and now LeBron gets Luka. So I think there's a lot of resentment among other fan bases, like, oh, of course, the Lakers got the guy again. What do you make of that from as a Lakers fan? Is it fair criticism, or is it just like, well, you don't have the allure that we have? Sorry, other teams.
I'm going to go back to a quote the late David Stern made decades ago. His idea of the ideal finals would be the Lakers against the Lakers. Love them, hate them, or indifferent to them, they are an allure franchise in the league. And if we're going to talk allure and Lakers, we've got to put the Celtics in there too, right? I think it's those two, and I think it's everybody else after that. Anyway, the Lakers franchise is a star-driven franchise. You mentioned Mikan, right? Jerry and Elgin in the 60s, and later they got Will Chamberlain, and they got Kareem later, then all the guys from Showtime in the 80s. And then there was a bit of a lull between when Magic retired, when Worthy retired, and then when they drafted Kobe, and then they added Shaq in free agency. So from that point, it went on, and then there was a couple of years gap between Kobe retiring and them signing LeBron. So pretty much my entire existence as a Lakers fan, we've had some major draw all along. Guys want to play in LA. The Lakers franchise insists on having at least one big name player who plays for the franchise. It's always been that way. As a fan, I wouldn't call it criticism, but if I were a non-fan, I might say that as well. Because the Lakers always seem to get their guy. Now, no disrespect to Rob Pelinka, but let's be honest, this fell in his lap. So for whatever, and I'll get back to Pelinka in a minute because I know there's some other stuff we want to talk about that. But there was really no way he could follow that up. I hated to see AD go. But to get a guy 5-6 years younger, all NBA player, I don't know if you're Pelinka. I don't know how you don't do that deal. Mm-hmm. Right? They call me, and if they call me and say, "Hey, we want to send you whomever and give us back this other person," if we're talking about a top 5 player in the league, I'm doing that trade 10 times out of 10. And ask any of the other 28 owners, they would tell you the same thing. They would have done that deal in a heartbeat.
The criticism from other fans, I also often hear it a lot from Celtics fans. So like, oh, Lakers always get the guy. And I was like, I mean, you guys, it's just a different aspect of team building. Boston has always drafted guys really well, for the most part.
Right.
And, has been able to develop them in that way. And the Lakers have been able to acquire them. It makes me think of like international soccer where like a Real Madrid always gets the guy they want, right? And that's basically what the Lakers are. And I think in the NBA, you're in a superstar-driven league. To act like you're just going to build organically through the draft for every single thing, it doesn't always work out that way. You have some exceptions, like the Thunder this year are very organically built, right? Mm-hmm. But ultimately, you're trying to acquire a star. It's what the Bucks tried to do when they acquired Damian Lillard. You're always trying to go after the guy. And it just feels like the Lakers just do a better job of that. Part of that is the mystique of Showtime, and part of that is the market in LA. But I think everybody's kind of playing the same game, and it's a little bit of sour grapes because you're like, oh, they did it again, almost like a whole evil empire type of thing. But I always do find it funny that like the loudest critics of that are Celtics fans because there's this big war of attrition of like who's going to get more titles and who's going to do this, who's going to do that. And, they're the kind of the main characters of the NBA show historically. Me as a Knicks fan, that pains me. But, the reality is the reality, right? But kind of want to talk about after the trade now. So you get Luka, you lose AD, and, your people are thinking, okay, this team could maybe make the Western Conference Finals. What was the expectations for the team for you once the trade was made, considering, when you make a midseason trade, you often don't see the fruits of that labor until the following season. So what were you kind of expecting post-trade?
Well, first of all, when the trade happened, Luka was injured.
Yep.
And didn't play for some time after he got to LA. And then there's the working himself back into playing shape, right? And we saw a lot of first team All NBA Luka after he got healthy for the most part. But there's still a hole in the 5 spot. No disrespect to Jackson Hayes. He's a great rim runner and all those things that he does really well. But he's not a defensive presence. And as evidenced by the fact that, JJ Redick didn't play him much in that series against Minnesota. So there was a glaring hole in the middle where, how else do you explain Rudy Gobert going for 27 and 24, in the series clincher? He really had nobody to guard him, no size, no physicality, none of those things. So you can small ball all day long, only up to a point. Mm-hmm. And I think that with Luka getting back into shape and looking a lot like the Luka we were all used to, there was an anticipation that I thought we could at least get past Minnesota in the first round. No disrespect to all of my Timberwolves fans who are watching. But the one thing that we couldn't account for is the size. Yep. Between Gobert, Naz Reid brings good size. Jaden McDaniels, quite as is kept at 6'9", 6'10", and quite athletic, more so than anybody the Lakers could throw at him to counter. So with all that said, The trade was great because I think the Lakers got better, but I never had this feeling that they were going to be contenders. They had to fill that hole in the middle. And speaking of which, the rescinded trade, I don't know that we'll ever know the details behind that, right? But I thought Mark Williams was a guy that could come in right away, rebound, play defense, rim run, all the things that Jackson Hayes, all the things Hayes can do, but also defend on the other end, crash the boards, set good screens on the offensive end, all those things. I thought he and Luka could have been a dynamic pick and roll combination. That could have really been something, I think. And then you had Luka and Mark Williams potentially in a pick and roll offensively. And then you got Austin Reeves and LeBron, spotting up at the 3-point line? Come on. That's almost unfair if you can have all that lined up, right? But, it is what it is. The Lakers lost in part because of the size. They lost in part because I don't think I would have ever played my entire starting five the entire second half of a must-win game. But I'm not a coach either so I'm trying to temper my criticism of all that stuff. JJ had a great first year. Let's call it what it is.
Right.
But I never really got the feeling that trade alone for this season was going to put the Lakers over the top. They still need a couple pieces. They need an entire summer of all the things that they normally do in the summer. My hope is that, Luka will spend some time with LeBron training because I think you could see later in that series against Minnesota, Luka having been injured and trying to play his way back into playing shape. I think there were some conditioning issues there towards the end of that series. And I think they were at least visible to me. And I think that had a lot to do with Luka's lack of ability to defend, at least from a competency standpoint. I'm not asking him to be first team all NBA defense. But I think as he gets in better conditioning shape, he'll be in a better position to maybe move those feet a little bit more. I'd like to see him draw a charge every couple of games or something like that, just to know that he's out there putting forth that effort on defense. Nobody questions his offensive ability, obviously, but I like to see that happen too. If we can see that growth, if the Lakers might get a competent big, maybe get a competent backup big, because the one thing we were lacking in that series was size. And I think no matter how the game is played from a 5-out perspective, you got to have a guy to match up with the other team's guy. The Nuggets have owned the Lakers the last couple of seasons because the Nuggets have arguably the best player in the world in Jokic, but also he's 8 feet tall and 500 pounds. And the Lakers haven't had anybody size-wise to match up with that. Whatever the other team's putting on the court, you got to put something out there to kind of sort of match it, unless you're a proficient three-point shooting team or unless you're a proficient transition team. And I don't think the Lakers showed enough of either this past season to make up for the lack of size.
Yeah, the Mark Williams woulda, coulda, shoulda is often just going to be one of those, man, what happened there to really make this fall apart? Obviously, he has a long injury history, so that's definitely going to be a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I, like you, I thought they would be able to get past Minnesota. Minnesota had such a strange year, post Towns trade and everything. And what really, like that clinching game, Gobert obviously has the 2020 game and, is just a menace. But also, like, in that series, Julius Randle was able to do whatever he wanted,
Mm-hmm.
and that was,
Mm-hmm.
there would be a lot of situations where Luka's matched up on Julius, which is just like, that's just a nightmare matchup for him just because of Randle's size and ability to get downhill. And I think, once you kind of saw what this was going to be and the lack of faith that JJ had in his bench, it was like, oh, okay, it's just not ready yet. And it's that they really just need somebody who is this kind of pick and pop roller to the rim, rim protector on defense, because that's what Luka's been successful with. You think about Gafford and Lively and the type of architect they have that has enabled him to have success when he was in Dallas. He needs that type of player. And I would be shocked if the Lakers didn't make that priority number one with a bullet this offseason, because
Right.
you do wonder, like, if that Mark Williams trade had gone through, how much different is that series? How much more effective are they defensively and offensively in that aspect? I want to talk about the LeBron era here. So I saw a post online recently, and they were like kind of calling the LeBron era a fraudulent era, and I was just like, all right, hold up. He made won a finals, right? Regardless, however you feel about the bubble or whatever, made a separate conference finals. A couple times missed the playoffs, and a few times lost in the first round. If I gave any fan and just holistically say, hey, you'll win a finals in the 7-year stretch, you'll also make a conference finals in addition to that, how would you consider that a success? Almost everybody would say yes, that's a success. But I think it's the Lakers, it's LeBron, it's also, there's connotations about the bubble championship that I think are misguided, but people feel however they're going to feel about it. As a Lakers fan, do you view the LeBron era as a success, a failure, or none of the above?
Omar, I think there's two sub questions. The first sub question is, are we talking about the LeBron era as opposed to other great players who played for the Lakers in the eras in which they played? And then all the other sub question is, what actually are we comparing? Are we comparing the greatness of the individual player? Are we comparing the success or lack thereof of the franchise with that great player on the roster? So there's a couple of ways I would go with that. If I'm looking at just LeBron himself, the talent, he is arguably top 3 all time, right? Love him, hate him, whatever. You can't deny the fact that he's at least top 3 all time, as far in my mind, anyway. And with that, the Lakers got a chance to acquire a player who was a great player when they got him in his mid 30s, and has remained a great player through the age of 40. We've had other 40-year-old players in the NBA, but we've never had one to play consistently at the level that LeBron has played, right? So for me, and again, because I'm on, so there's a bias there, right?
Right.
But with, so trying to check my bias as best I can. I think from a standpoint of being able to have arguably the best player in the league, or at least certainly a top 5 player in the league, lead your franchise into age 40. I think just from that piece of it, that's a success, because you were able to acquire a player who hasn't not fallen off. Okay? LeBron has not fallen off from the time he joined the Lakers. As a matter of fact, you might make an argument the last 2 seasons he's been better than he was when he got to LA. Right? Now, LeBron in the context of the franchise and how well the franchise has done. Well, let's take a look at who has won championships since LeBron got to LA. So he got there in 2018. So in 2019, Toronto won, which they had Kawhi. Some injuries to the Warriors, right? That helped. Hi, Toronto fans, I love y'all, but let's face fact. Those injuries did help. The Lakers won in the bubble in 2020. I want to come back to that because the Lakers have gotten way too much crap for winning a bubble championship. And they got crap that the other 29 franchises would have loved to have won that bubble championship. Don't let them fool you, Omar. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So the Lakers won in 2020. And of course, the Lakers haven't won one since. We have not had a repeat champion, although we'll see. I forgot who won in 21. Do you remember?
That was, let's see, because the Golden State won in 22. Oh, the Bucks won in 21.
Milwaukee won in, okay. And Milwaukee hasn't gotten out of the first round since then.
Right.
Right. And that's not to knock them. That's go back and look. That's the fact, right? Golden State won in 22. There might be an argument that Boston maybe should have won that title, but Golden State won it, right? And then Denver won in 23, and then Boston won last year.
Right.
So we take Boston out of the equation. you go back and look over the period from when LeBron joined the Lakers won as many championships as anybody else who had won a title in that time frame, right? So was the Lakers' time with LeBron a success? Yes, it was, from the perspective of they won as much as anybody else did who won. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I would say. Now, if Golden State had won a couple of titles, if the Celtics had won a couple of titles, and they might still win this one, so other than those, if somebody else had won more often, then I still wouldn't call it a failure. It just wouldn't have been as successful as, And I go back to, was it 2 years ago when the reporter asked Giannis was his season a failure?
Oh yeah, yeah.
That great speech he gave about that. I don't think it's a failure if you don't win, because it's hard. Everybody who's ever won a championship in any sport at any level will tell you it's hard, right? Would I've loved the Lakers to have beaten Denver 2 years ago? Yes, especially because the way Malone was talking crap about my Lakers. So there's that. But I would rate the Lakers just as successful from a championship standpoint as the other teams were who won. And the Lakers arguably has still maybe a top 5 player in the world or top 3 player in the world still on the roster, still playing at a high level. So all that, Omar, to say, do I deem the Lakers with LeBron a success? Yes. That's the bottom line.
There's a context here too, right? Where we're living in this era of parity that we haven't seen in the NBA since the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you looked back at the 70s, the Knicks won twice, and I believe the Celtics won once or twice. But other than that, everything was a one-off situation. The Blazers won their title then, the Sonics won their title then, and it was just, there was just a scattering of talent across the league. And that's what it is now. Every team has one or two guys, even the lower level teams, that if you squint hard enough, you could see them being an all-star eventually. Like even the lottery teams, have that. And so because of that, you could say, oh, well, Anthony Davis, LeBron James, these are guys that should have won multiple times in this time period. But then you think about, hold on, but you also have the emergence of Brown and Tatum in Boston. You also have, you have a lot of guys coming up at the same time, and you could only win but so much when you have a league that doesn't really have a preeminent dynasty or two dynasties, so to speak, like they did in the 80s with the Celtics and Lakers. So I think that gets lost in it because it's like, well, it's LeBron. And he made the finals all those years in a row. And well, is this a referendum on how bad the East really was then? And I would say it's really more the league has just gotten a lot better and a lot deeper, that even just like bad teams can turn it around. You look at Detroit, they are able to turn it around this year, become a playoff team. They're going to be contending in the East for the next 5 years or more, and that's something that I think that people forget about when it comes to their analysis of LeBron, the Laker. And I think when you look at what the Lakers were post Kobe, they were kind of really struggling, right? You mentioned it, at the top, that there was a lull, after Kobe retired. And then before LeBron got there, it was kind of like, well, what are we doing? Obviously, when they drafted Lonzo Ball, Julius Randle, Brandon Ingram, Josh Hart, all these guys were drafted, and, they eventually become parts of an AD trade and all that. But, it just kind of, they were not in a situation where there was a preeminent dynasty, and he brought them back into, at the very least, becoming a consistent playoff team. And again, you get to a conference final and you win a final. I want to double back on the bubble thing. So from your perspective, like, I always look at it as, LeBron, I think, has said that it was one of the hardest titles to ever win from a mental aspect, because you're quarantined in this bubble. There's so much going on in the world. COVID-19 is running rampant. And here you are in this secluded situation. You're in an arena with screens instead of fans. It's just such a different type of situation. And you had the big break in between when play was suspended, in between when it started back up in the bubble. So, well, what's your kind of response as a Laker fan of people say fraudulent championship, Mickey Mouse championship, whatever they want to say?
Well, the first question I would have for those people is, what makes it fraudulent? Was it because the only thing I keep coming back to is it was fraudulent because the Lakers won it. It would be fraudulent because the Celtics won it if it had gone the way that it had gone, right? Because it's the Lakers and Celtics and everybody else, right? Always historically, that's where it's been. Um, so I took offense to all the comments about the championship being fraudulent. Okay, who's your team? Has your team ever won anything? And are you telling me that you would not be ecstatic if your team won that championship? If you can sit here with a straight face on a stack of Bibles and swear to me that if you are a Minnesota Timberwolves fan or a Bucks fan or whoever you root for, and if you would illegitimize that championship because of the way it was won, then maybe I'll believe you. A championship, as we mentioned earlier, winning is hard.
Mm-hmm.
Winning championships is really, really hard. Now add the fact that you can't travel, which probably was a benefit to a lot of teams. Everybody's right there together, right? So, and then they had to change the rules about how many games you had to play. And then from that, add that to the games that had already been played before to determine who's going to make the playoffs. So there was a lot there that was different, not just being in the bubble, but how the rules were changed to determine who's going to make the playoffs. If you remember, Phoenix won every game in the bubble, but hadn't done enough before the bubble to even make the playoffs, right? So I don't know. So maybe the guys that played for the Suns that year thought it was fraudulent because they did all this winning when they got there and they didn't even have a chance to get to the playoffs. But it was fraudulent. It was whatever. It's insulting to us Lakers fans, number one, and I think it's insulting to basketball in general. They took a situation that you couldn't win. No matter what you did, you suspend the season, people are going to be mad. You put everybody in one location and play the games, people are going to be mad. Whatever method you use to determine who's going to make the postseason, somebody was going to be mad. So there's never a way to please everybody anyway. But in that situation, it's just difficult to make everybody happy. So I think Adam Silver and the people that worked for the NBA took what was really a horrible situation, because on the outside of the bubble, people are dying from COVID. So let's put basketball in its perspective. In the outside world, there was so much craziness going on that, if I had an opportunity to go to Orlando and be sequestered for 2 months and play, and all I had to worry about was playing basketball, man, sign me up for that. I'd do that in a heartbeat. Yeah, I'm not removing myself from what's going on in the outside world, but I also can't affect it. So if I'm over here doing my thing, I would much rather be doing that. Maybe people will agree with that. Maybe people won't. That's okay. That's my opinion, right? So I challenge anybody who still says 5 years later that was a fraudulent championship. Tell me if you would turn down a chance to win that title if it was your team.
From the perspective of a fan of a team that has not won in my lifetime, I can tell you that. Now, the Knicks were super bad that year. They weren't invited to the bubble. So this is a total hypothetical. Like, if it was the Knicks there and they had won a title, like, I'd be up for joy. I wouldn't be like, oh, I really wish we could have sealed Game 6 at MSG. It's like, yeah, of course, that would be great. But, to have the fan experience of it all and all that. But the title's still a title. And people, I think, if it was any other team, the Clippers, if the Clippers had won that title that year, because they had a pretty good team that year, that was obviously first year of PG and Kawhi, then do you think that they wouldn't proudly display that banner into it? Like, come on, man. Like, there is a little bit of, it's because it's the Lakers that you are going to say it's fake and it's because it's LeBron, right? Because those are the two forces that have so much hatred towards them in the basketball ecosystem, because there's so many people who can't stand LeBron and there's so many people who really hate the Lakers. And it reminds me of a friend of mine. She is both a Celtics fan and LeBron hater, so it's maximum energy towards the Lakers and LeBron. I have one more LeBron topic for you, Ken. And I think when he first got there was this hesitancy from the outside looking in of that a lot of Lakers fans were primarily Kobe fans in the moment, and we're just like, not accepting it because they were used to, here's a guy we acquire via draft trade. He was a Laker for life. It wasn't really the same situation as it was with LeBron, where kind of his greatness was already achieved. Even Shaq, he hadn't won it yet, and he was still ascending into prime Shaquille O'Neal. His best years were still with the Lakers, regardless of how you feel about it. And there's almost like there was a rejection. It's almost like you had a transplant and the body's rejecting it, and that's kind of what it was for LeBron. So considering after that, as we don't know when LeBron's going to retire. It could be this offseason, could be in the next year or two. How do you think Lakers fans are going to remember him as a Laker when it's all said and done? Is he embraced into that inner circle of Kareem, Magic, Worthy, Kobe, Shaq, or is he maybe almost like an outsider kind of looking in?
That is a great question, and here's how I'll answer that. If I go back throughout my Laker fandom history to when Kareem was traded there, and also remember the Lakers traded Norm Nixon for the rights to draft Byron Scott. I think is how that went down. But most everybody else that was part of Showtime, all the great players the Lakers have had, and then later with the exception of Shaq, I believe were all drafted into the franchise. So they were most of the guys who built the Lakers up in the 80s and after were homegrown guys, right? So we got a chance to watch them become who they became. We got a chance to see them become the Hall of Fame players. And you mentioned a minute ago with Shaq. Shaq's prime years were in LA. I think everybody would agree with that. So you could see when he was in Orlando that, it was there, and they made a finals that year. The year before he left for LA, they made the finals. They lost to Houston in the sweep, but they made the finals that year with Shaq. So you could see then Shaq could be somebody. He could be the guy. So taking Kareem and Shaq into consideration, most everybody else who had a hand in Lakers' success from 1975 on were most of them, if not all of them, were drafted by the franchise. So with that context in place, now you have, and you mentioned this earlier, Omar, LeBron is an established all-time great by the time he gets to the Lakers. And there's still, somebody posted on Threads just last week that they're still mad at LeBron for the decision. Let me remind y'all that the decision was 15 years ago. Do any of us want to be judged by any mistakes we made 15 years ago, even to this day? Okay, now that I've said that, there were Lakers fans and LeBron haters. Okay, just like your friend is a Boston Celtics fan and a LeBron hater. So there are people who don't like LeBron who are Lakers fans. Now LeBron is coming to your team, which we shouldn't have been surprised. LeBron has spent the last 2 years in Cleveland probably setting that whole thing up to come to LA, right? And then when he won the title in 2016, it was just like, oh well, we know he's going to leave now because he done for Cleveland what nobody else has been able to do, right? So I think LeBron as a Laker, on the whole, has not been, is not now, nor ever will be accepted as a true Laker. Because of his established greatness when he got there, because there are so many people that inexplicably don't like him, and because there are so many people who still had that love for Kobe. But even when Kobe embraced him as a Laker, that should have been enough for other people to say, okay, you know what? Kobe says he's okay. Then for me, that's how I hoped it would have gone. Because Kobe says, I embrace him. He's a Laker. He's here. He's wearing the purple and gold. We need to embrace him like y'all embrace me. Well, that never happened. That has not happened. And no matter how much longer LeBron plays, that's not going to happen. I've had to make peace with that because I don't understand why people don't like him in the first place. The super team, blah, blah, blah. Well, they did that in Boston 2 years earlier, so I don't want to hear that. He only won 4 championships and he needed help to win those. Okay, well, there are other great players, I'm not calling any names, who never won anything until they got better players with them,
Hmm.
right? So the only difference in that is LeBron went to where the great players were or were going.
Right.
Um, but then he grew as a player while he was in Miami, so he can go back to Cleveland and win that whole thing before he ends up going to LA. So anyway, but to answer your question, um, I don't think LeBron's ever been accepted as a Laker in the way that we accepted past greats as Lakers. If it hasn't happened by now, it hasn't happened after a championship. It's not going to happen. And I just had to get to a point where I was okay with that. And I think it's a shame because as a Lakers fan, we've embraced everybody else that came through.
Mm.
What's different about him other than your personal hatred for whatever reason that is?
You know, a lot of the criticisms you mentioned there, like needing great players to win a title, and I always push back against people who say that because outside of the Sonics in the '70s, the Mavericks when Dirk won, and probably the 2004 Pistons, you have to have two guys who are all-star level to win a title.
Mm-hmm.
You look all the way throughout history, all those great Celtics teams, it wasn't just Bird by himself. It was Bird and McHale. It was Magic and Kareem. Throw in Worthy as well if you want to as well in terms of just like a high-level player. Every single team has had that with the exception of those three. And it just shows you the anomaly of it to be able to do it with just one guy. You saw about as far as it could take you was when you saw it in the early 2000s with Allen Iverson, of just the one guy only to do it by himself. But those guys are the rarity, where the situation just lines up perfectly for them. And most of the time you need at least two. And we've evolved into a situation where every team is two. And, to people who always kind of bring up the decision, I think it's also a testament to just how clean of a career LeBron has had, where there's no controversy or anything like that, is that to the point where your only main criticism of him is going to be like, well, he forced trades and he did the decision, and trust me, there's a lot worse unscrupulous things that NBA stars have done over the years to make the general public not like them.
Amen to that.
Yeah, and the funny thing is too, Ken, you mentioned how a lot of people's like, oh, well, he's not a true Laker, and again, it's not an episode of this podcast if I don't somehow make it about the Knicks, but I think like in Knicks circles we have this thing: once a Knick, always a Knick, right? That's kind of this big thing where if you play for the franchise, you're embraced with open arms. It's why we still love to see like Raymond Felton. Right, just a guy who was okay for a couple of years for us, right? You look at these Knicks playoff games, you've seen, it's not just seeing Patrick Ewing, right? You'll see guys like Tim Thomas, and he'll get love from the Garden crowd. It's that just kind of that team's culture, but it's like the standard for the Lakers is so interesting because it's like, well, yeah, you won us a title, and yeah, you were our star player for 5, 6, 7 years, but also you weren't here developing, so not good enough. And that's just kind of that's crazy to me. Again, just as somebody who's a fan of a team that looks at its past players a little bit differently. It's just and that just goes to show you the standard of the Lakers, right? The standard is being a part of a dynasty, winning multiple titles, doing it for a very long stretch of time, which is why, and it's so hard when you're following a guy like Kobe, who is just like, when you would tell people of a certain age, Los Angeles Lakers, what do you think of immediately? Chances are the answer was Kobe for like people like in their 30s now, or maybe a little bit younger. And that's just so hard to do, to walk into a situation and be content with it. And I think he is content with it. But I want to close out here kind of looking towards the future. So the trade's done. You have Luka now. You have LeBron for however many more years he wants to play. For you, is the expectation moving forward you have to compete for a championship every year for the next decade while you have Luka Doncic? Or are you maybe a little bit more lenient on that rigid of an expectation?
I think you need a year for Pelinka to earn his keep and build a roster that's going to contend. The roster, obviously, as it currently exists, is not a contending roster. Had it been with those two guys, with Luka and LeBron on the team, they should have gone further in the playoffs if that were the case. So obviously, The roster is not there. So you need pieces. You need other guys that fill a role that currently can't be filled with the guys on the roster. A lot of teams can probably say that, but that's how I feel about that. So I think looking forward, I think next season there needs to be shown, the franchise needs to be shown a little bit of grace by Lakers fans. We don't know what it's going to look like. We know we need some size. Austin Reeves reached another level this year, and he can't be stagnant. We need him to continue to ascend and step into his greatness, whatever that's going to be. And then all the other pieces on the team. If we get an 82 game schedule from a healthy Jared Vanderbilt, that could be huge. If we could get a healthy season out of some of these other cats, such as Dorian Finney-Smith, Maxi Kleber, who played an important role in the Mavericks getting to the finals last year when he played, but hasn't been healthy, right? So can you win with the guys that you have if they're healthy? No. So then what do you do? Okay, well, you have to take stock of what you have, take stock of what you need, and make that happen. Chemistry is a funny thing too. Chemistry is not something that happens immediately. You look at the Thunder. I think they have dynamic team chemistry. I think that is one of the most cohesive, close-knit teams I've seen in the NBA in a long time. That may or may not translate to a title. When you see those guys when they play, they don't do a lot of talking. I don't think they have to do a lot of talking. Everybody knows what their role is. Everybody knows what they're supposed to do. They just go out and do it. And then they all seem to care about each other. Post-game interviews is never just one guy. Everybody shows up for the post-game interview. Fake. That's what chemistry looks like, right? And they're young and hungry and all those things. But that chemistry didn't happen overnight. That chemistry didn't happen in the course of one season or even two seasons. That's built over time. That's built with time spent with those guys when there's no basketball being played, right? So I say all that in support of to answering your question about what the long term looks like. Next year is going to have to be whatever it's going to be. While you bring new pieces in, while you see how they fit, can you create chemistry on the fly? Is that going to take some time? And then the question that's over the Lakers every offseason, what's LeBron going to do? And I think that roster building looks three different ways. If LeBron retires this summer, how do you build the roster knowing he's not coming back? If LeBron commits to playing one more year, how do you build a roster knowing that you've got one more year with him? And if he stays beyond 2026, then what does the roster look like then? How do you build a roster then? Because the uncertainty with LeBron, I think, is the biggest thing about how you build around Luka going forward. But I think the decision to build around him is key. Get him a rim runner. That was a great thing he had in Dallas. Austin Reeves has become a reliable three-point shooter. I like to see Dalton Connect, work on that some more in the summer, and get more playing time as a result, because that's what he did at Tennessee. He shot the lights out there. Guys who should be on the floor, spotting up, making threes, have those guys on the floor when you can, but have enough of them that you don't do a game 4 against Minnesota where you only have 5 guys on the floor for the second half. Mm-hmm. So how do you build around Luka? I think a lot of that, like I said, depends on how long LeBron is going to be there, and which seems like every year is kind of like a year-to-year thing. So I would think. So what I think you have to do, and what I guess if I were Rob Pelinka, what I would do is I would try to build a team around Luka long term, whether LeBron's going to be there or not, because we know he might play 2 more years. And then you can't wait till he leaves, to try to build around Luka. Do that now. Get the pieces around him now. Have the conversation with Luka. What would you like to see? What do you think is going to give you the best chance for individual success, and what's going to give our franchise the best chance for team success? If LeBron's there, he's there, and we can work with that because he, again, all-time top 3 player for me. But what does Rob Pelinka think it's going to take to get LeBron, to get Luka to stay past next season? Number one, because otherwise, everything I just said, none of that matters, right? So get Luka to sign the extension, and then have the conversation with him about what pieces you think we need, so we can have some long-term success while you're here, whether LeBron is in the mix or not. And that's not to say LeBron. Well, I'm about to contradict myself. I was going to say that's not to say LeBron shouldn't be involved, but at this point, whatever the roster building he's done over the course of his time in LA, I think we can't talk to him about what the franchise needs to look like 5 years from now because he won't be there.
Right.
That conversation you have with Luka, because you want him to be here in 5 years. I think you start with him about what you want, what pieces, what works best for not necessarily individual players, but what type of player do we need that's going to get you back to first team All NBA and get us more championships.
I think if you're the Lakers, you got to look no further than the way that the Mavericks built around Luka last year. And, a lot of people are kind of dumping on Nico Harrison in the wake of the trade, but acquiring Derrick Jones Jr., acquiring PJ Washington, acquiring Gafford, and drafting Derek Lively, in addition to acquiring Kyrie, that's the formula. A secondary ball handler, right, to be able to take the burden off of, the usage of Luka. You have a rim protector in the middle, and then you got guys who can defend on the wing and hit threes. That's the formula, right? And I think the Austin Reeves question is an interesting one, because when you're planning for the post-LeBron reality, because right now LeBron is the secondary ball, right? To Luka, and he is the Kyrie in that aspect. Obviously, if you were to say Kyrie and LeBron have the same role on the surface, it sounds ridiculous because they're two totally different players.
Right.
But in this aspect of creation, that's kind of the way it's set up. You need Austin Reeves to eventually be that guy, and I think this next year is a good evaluation on Austin Reeves, because after next year he has a player option, and if he goes up a level, he is 100% declining that player option for a bigger deal, and he's taken a step up. So I think he would obviously get a lot of interest on the open market, and if he takes that level up, then he's like, okay, well, that's the guy, that's the running mate. If he doesn't, you have to ask yourself, okay, is this a spot we can upgrade from? And that, to me, becomes the most interesting thing about the Lakers for the next 5 years, is what is Austin Reeves going to become? Because we know what Luka is, right? We know what Luka is capable of. He's an MVP caliber type talent. That's set in stone. But it's really his second guy in Reeves, because you got to look at LeBron as just a nice to have for however long you have him.
Right.
And that's kind of where we're at. And that's what makes their future so interesting, because a lot of people are like, oh, they're going to be, contending because they got Luka. It's like, well, hold on. You also have to be able to get the ancillary pieces around him to also make sense, because Luka does need a certain type of roster build. It's kind of like, people hate that I make this comparison all the time, but it reminds me a lot of Houston era James Harden, where you have this heliocentric ball handler. Their best years when they brought in a secondary ball handler in Chris Paul and had Clint Capella in the middle and guys on the wings to shoot and defend. And it's the same formula. A friend of mine who loves Luka, I often just tease him. I was like, it's like, yeah, he's basically White Harden. Obviously, Luka is better than James Harden now, but that was always the way I would tease him. But the roster build is very similar. And I think if the Lakers don't do that, like you said, that's a real inflection point of Rob Pelinka, because he's getting all the praise right now. It's like, wow, you executed the heist of the century. But in reality, you were just kind of there to accept the heist as opposed to executing. Right. Yeah, you answered the phone, right? And so now his real test becomes, are you going to be able to build this team around him? And if you can't, then that becomes a big issue for the Lakers moving forward. But Ken, I've taken up too much of your time. I want to just thank you so much for doing this. If you guys are all on Threads, Ken is an awesome follow, at your cool Uncle Ken. A lot of great basketball talk, a lot of great just conversation in general. I always just value your opinion on so much. So
Thank
thank you again. Yeah, thank you again for joining me. If you all enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to give us a follow on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are a video podcast on Spotify, so if you want to see us just move our mouths for an hour, you do that on Spotify. Anyway, Ken, thanks again for joining me, and thank you all for tuning in to another
Omar, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you for the invite, and
Yeah.
hopefully down the road we can do this again.
I can't wait, man. I can't
All
wait.
right,
We'll
great.
definitely have to. All right, thank you, everybody, and we'll check you all out next time.